Hi everyone, my name is Manda Larga Espada, and I am a student here at Oregon State University studying the effect of prairie dog towns on plant diversity within an urban environment for the field sampling in fish and wildlife class at OSU. So let's get started here. To provide some background on my study, the focal species is the black-tailed prairie dog, scientific name Sinomys ludovicianus. The black-tailed prairie dog can be found throughout the Great Plains region of the United States, and that can extend from Montana centrally down to the state of Texas. And they are typically found within a variety of short grass prairie lands and flatlands in particular. And if you were to walk through a prairie dog town, you would notice the characteristic crater like mounds that lead to an underground tunneling system. And prairie dog towns are what they're called, and it's basically a colony of prairie dogs. And the towns can be further divided because of fragmentation due to urbanization, for example, or topography. And if they are further divided, they are called wards. All right, and here we have an example in the picture of a prairie dog mound and what it typically looks like. And this is a photo that I took in Colorado at my study site. And as you can see, some of the vegetation, which is soapweed yucca, has been trimmed down. And basically, that's what they like to do. They like to trim down the vegetation, which helps them to keep a lookout for predators. So, just to go on a little bit about some of the different habits that are exhibited by black-tailed prairie dogs. Like I mentioned, they consume a lot of grasses, forbs, roots, sedges, and at times they will eat insects. And they use their burrowing system to escape from predators for breeding purposes and also to avoid adverse weather conditions because they do not hibernate. And they typically mate in February and March and will produce anywhere between 1 to 8 pups per breeding season. And if you were to walk around a prairie dog town, you would definitely hear them because they are very vocal. They bark, they yip, they chatter, and this is all a part of their communication, mainly surrounding predators. So they will use different variations or levels of communication or vocalizations that alert other members in the colony of a particular predator, such as, oh, it's a rattlesnake, or it's a coyote, or someone's dog, for example. And they also alert each other of the proximity of these predators to the burrows. And so this gets to my point of why I decided to research black-tailed prairie dogs. And the first important thing to note is that they are a keystone species, so a lot of other animals depend on them, as we can see in this photo here of a burrowing owl, which is making use of a prairie dog mound, using it as its own habitat. So other animals depend on them. They're also a prey species as well. So coyotes, for example, will eat prairie dogs, also hawks and eagles. So they're very important to the ecosystem and to keep the food source cycling there. They also promote healthy soils, so they add nitrogen to the soil through their fecal matter, and this will just improve the soil and help to improve overall vegetation growth. And also, because of their burrowing habits and their tilling habits, they aerate the soils and they also help to increase water penetration within the soil. And, some of the obstacles that prairie dogs encounter is fragmentation, habitat fragmentation, and this is because of expanding urbanization, also because of eradication regimes. Because a lot of landowners, for example, don't like them being on their land because they feel like they're being destructive or a nuisance. And also, they received a bad rap because of plague outbreaks in various colonies. And it's not actually the prairie dog that carries the plague, it's a flea that carries and transmits the plague to the prairie dog. And that leads to my research question, which is, does the presence of a black-tailed prairie dog town increase the diversity of plant species? And my hypothesis is that plant diversity will be higher in prairie dog towns compared to uncolonized plots. For my study site, I selected Stanley Lake, which is located in Westminster, Colorado, which is about 10 miles outside of Denver, Colorado. The area is pretty urban, suburban. The Stanley Lake Park is approximately 1,000 acres, and there are concentrated prairie dog sites on both south and north of the lake. And there's a centralized lake or reservoir, as you see in photo 5 here of the map of the study site. And the site is fragmented pretty heavily by roadways. There's a road on all 4 sides of the park, and there's also a walking path which people use to ride their bikes, walk their dogs, jog, for example. And there are also a variety of predators within the park, such as coyotes, hawks, and there's actually a secluded eagle habitat as well. And since the park is heavily fragmented by a path, I decided to select 6 colonized prairie dog plots that are approximately 48 feet in length. I selected 3 plots that are colonized by prairie dogs on the north side and 3 on the south side of the lake. And then I selected 2 uncolonized plots, one on the north and one on the south side of the lake. And I did that to consider the varied topography, the varied predator species, and also proximity to the lake, which might influence soil factors, such as soil moisture, for example. And within each plot, I used a 25-foot transect line, and I selected where I place my transect line at random just to add some randomization to my study. And when I laid down my transect line, I would count each plant that touched the transect line, and I would record that on my data sheet and journal, and also take photographs for identification purposes. So with the results, both the uncolonized plots and colonized prairie dog plots included the same number of species. I counted a total of 9 different species for both types of plots, uncolonized and colonized. And I noted that the uncolonized plot had less vegetation cover, more bare soil, compared to the prairie dog sites, which had a lot more vegetation cover, particularly green deciduous vegetation. And so looking at the table here, table 1 of the prairie dog site, the species count that I tallied came to 567 plants counted compared to the uncolonized plots, which I counted 116 plants altogether. So that gives you an idea as to the cover, a lot more bare soil with the uncolonized plots. And the results displayed a higher abundance of native and non-native deciduous vegetation and flowering plant species within the prairie dog plots. As you can see here, we have an abundance of species A, which was actually curly dock, compared to the uncolonized plots, which had a little bit more heterogeneity of various prairie grasses, non-native and native. So there was a higher abundance of needle grasses, wheat grasses, and awned grasses in the uncolonized plots compared to the prairie dog plots. And also, the results of the plant diversity survey further displayed higher plant species richness within the prairie dog sites compared to the uncolonized plots. So here we have lower lower species richness within the uncolonized plots compared to higher species richness within the colonized plots. And that mainly relates to the heterogeneity of the prairie grasses seen in the uncolonized plots compared to the curly dock vegetation that was heavily observed in the prairie dog plots. And so, in conclusion, the results did not fully support my hypothesis that plant diversity would be higher in prairie dog sites compared to uncolonized plots because both of the plots contain the same number of different species, which was 9 different species per plot. However, I did notice some differences. So, as we see in photo 9, the vegetation is much more green in the prairie dog plots with the abundance of curly dock and deciduous vegetation compared to photo 9 at the bottom here, which was one of the common grasses observed in the uncolonized plots. And as you can see, it's a little bit brownish and kind of like a dead plant material observation was seen in the uncolonized plots. And just to show you a little bit more here, photo 11 and 12, these are different plant species that I found in the prairie dog sites as well. So because it was springtime, I would always come across a brand new species. And although it was interesting, it was a little bit overwhelming trying to figure out what these species are. And of course, it's springtime, so things are budding and flowering and always looking a little bit different every time I go back every week. But it was just really cool to see the different vegetation types and just the different plants that were associated with the prairie dog site. So these are just these two pictures here are examples of that vegetation. And so I think it's important to consider other factors because the results did not fully support my hypothesis. Again, the habitat was highly fragmented because of urbanization. Other wildlife may contribute to vegetation patterns within the park. So, with the uncolonized sites, I noticed a lot more bird activity. So, that might contribute to a different pattern in the niche that relates to the bird activity compared to prairie dog sites. And also, the sample period was very short. Maybe the results would be a little bit different if I extended the sample period into August, for example. And also, I think it's important to note that, prairie dogs contribute positively to the ecosystem. They are a prey species, so they provide food for various predator animals. And also, they're a keystone species, so they provide habitat for various wildlife, such as the burrowing owl or the rattlesnake. And just going over the results and the data that I collected for future studies, I think it would be really interesting to consider the contributions made by prairie dogs to soil quality because the uncolonized plots exhibited a higher amount of dead plant material. So I am wondering if, prairie dogs were in that spot, would the plant material be healthy and green compared to uncolonized areas because they're adding those nutrients and they're tilling and aerating the soil. So I think for future studies, it would be interesting to compare the soil quality between the different plot types. And so I thank you guys for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to listening to your presentations as well and learning about your focal species and your studies and just learning about your overall experience out in the field. So thank you guys. Bye-bye.